Can an iPad replace a computer? I can't answer that question for you because it depends. It depends on what you need it to do. What I can do is to share my experience as a photographer and a YouTuber, because for the last 6 months I've been using an iPad, and only an iPad, for all my photography and video work. Every image and every video that you've seen in that time was made on this iPad. In this video, I'm gonna tell you everything about this experience, what I love the most about the iPad, what's been great about the iPad, but also what's been not so great, what I miss and what I wish I could do with my iPad. And look, I'm not here to sell you an iPad, I'm really not. The iPad is just a tool, like a camera, and you know what I think about them. What matters the most is what we make with them, what we create with them, and not how we do it. The last thing I want is to make you feel like you have to buy something, like you need something. You probably don't. I'm sure that some of you are wondering why. Why would anyone want to use an iPad? For me, there are several reasons. The first one is size. I just love how light, how compact, how small it is compared to my 15-inch MacBook Pro. It is just much easier to carry with you when you are traveling. Battery life is great as well, it just lasts much longer than a regular laptop. Not only that, but it can also be charged using an external battery or the car, which is a huge deal for me when I'm traveling or off the grid. That way I can take advantage of the dead hours that I have when I'm camping and it's dark outside, there is nothing to do. I can work on my images, I can work on my videos and stuff like that. LTE support, I don't need to rely on Wi-Fi like with the computer. The pencil. This thing is amazing. I love editing my images with it or just writing on the iPad as if it were a notebook. And of course, because it doubles as a tablet, because it is a tablet. So I use it to watch TV or YouTube, to play music, to play podcasts, to read electronic books, to play video games, and whatever you might use a tablet for. I've had an iPad for a long time, for many years, along with my computer, and that might seem the perfect solution to get the best of both worlds. We can use an iPad when it makes sense to use an iPad, and we can use the computer when it makes sense to use a computer. And I agree, that is probably the best approach for most people. I personally decided to ditch the computer because I believe that the simpler the better. If I can do everything I need to do with one device instead of two, I will choose that one device any day, even if it comes with some downsides like the iPad does. My iPad is an iPad Pro 11 inches from 2018, the model with 1 terabyte and LTE. Now, I got it from Amazon renewed, so it was a used unit, but I got it for almost half the price. Ever since I bought the Sony A7Rii for a fraction of its original price, I really like this approach of buying high-end tech from 2 or 3 years ago with a significant discount. Along with the iPad, I also bought the keyboard plus trackpad case to use it as if it were a laptop. I got the pencil, as you could see, and also a cheap third-party case to use it as well as a tablet. With this case, I can use my iPad to watch videos while I'm on the treadmill, to read books, and to do many things that a tablet can do with a little bit of protection. I got the 11 inches because size is really important for me. My absolute favorite laptop of all time is the iBook G4, back when Apple was still using PowerPCs. That was my first laptop and I loved the 12 inches screen. I use it for personal stuff, for work, for years, and it still works today. I know this is a very personal choice. Most people prefer to work with bigger screens, but for me 11 inches is just enough to work with images. If you need more real estate, you can always connect it to an external monitor. Just be aware that this is just mirroring the screen of the iPad and it's gonna keep the same aspect ratio, so it's pretty limiting as of right now. Overall, the hardware is pretty good, the screen is very bright and sharp, the speakers are very loud, the cameras are supposed to be good, but I don't really use them. And the whole thing, the whole experience is really fast and smooth. I really wish it had a built-in SD card slot, because dongle life is really not for me. iOS has come a long way on the iPad and it has brought much needed features from the desktop like file management, SD card and hard drive support, mouse and trackpad support, and multitasking. Storage is one of the main concerns when switching to an iPad, understandably so, because Apple charges a lot for extra storage. If you work a lot with hard drives, the iPad might not be for you, because while it supports external hard drives and it has a Files app so you can copy and move files to and from a hard drive, it is not the best experience. The app is really buggy, it's really unreliable. It corrupted one of my hard drives. Good thing I didn't have anything important in it, and I couldn't use it anymore because you can't format a hard drive with the iPad, so I had to get a computer for that. One thing I totally forgot to mention is that while the apps have access to hard drives and they can read the files, copy files to and from hard drives, they cannot work off a hard drive. So things that are very common among photographers, like having your Lightroom catalog in an external hard drive, that is not going to work here. For me, 1 terabyte is enough to store thousands of photos and several hours of 4K footage. Then I rely on the cloud. I use a Lightroom CC. My whole photo catalog is in the cloud, so I can delete the local copies from my iPad once they are backed up. And once I'm done with the videos that I'm working on for YouTube, I will either delete the clips or just upload them to Google Photos. So I don't store anything on my iPad. Everything that is in there is just temporary because I'm working on it, and once I'm done, I can safely delete it. The mouse and the trackpad support has been just fine. Many apps are still not very friendly, and some websites are kind of a nightmare to navigate, but it's fine. Keyboard support has been available for years now, and many apps like LumaFusion really let you control the whole experience with shortcuts. Unfortunately, others like Lightroom are still not there yet. Lightroom has a handful of shortcuts that you can use to navigate through your catalog, but it doesn't support any shortcuts to access any of the editing tools like you can do on the desktop. I really miss that, and I really hope that Adobe brings more shortcuts to their mobile app soon. Multitasking works just fine too. Technically, iOS lets you run 2 apps side by side and a third one floating somewhere. It works, but the whole thing is very confusing and it takes a while to get used to it. My main problem with multitasking is that the apps have to be in the foreground to complete time-consuming tasks. For example, when you're exporting video in LumaFusion, the app has to be open. If you open another app, or if you go to your home screen or something like that, if the app leaves the foreground and goes to the background, then the whole process stops, and the next time that you open the app, you'll have to start over. The same thing happens when you're exporting photos in Lightroom. It doesn't stop the process though, it just pauses it, but it's still very annoying. So developers can handle this situation in different ways, but they can't get around the limitations that Apple sets on their apps. And I understand that they do this so an app doesn't drain your battery in the background without you realizing about it, but I just wish we had at least the option to override that default behavior for some apps like Lightroom and LumaFusion. Lightroom is where I spend most of the time on my iPad and pretty much the only app that I use to edit my photos. My workflow is pretty similar to the one that I had on my computer, if not exactly the same. The first step is, of course, to import the images into the Lightroom catalog, which I'm gonna do, oops, I almost spilled my tea, which I'm gonna do using a dongle. My MacBook didn't have an SD card slot either, so I'm pretty used to using dongles, but it doesn't make it less annoying. It is very annoying to have to carry this thing everywhere with you. In any case, importing the images is really simple. We just plug the dongle on the iPad, and Lightroom is asking us already if we want to import the images that we have in the SD card. So these are some images that I made this morning and some images that I made other days that I hadn't imported yet, so I'm gonna do that. I always import my images into this album called Imports. I'm gonna talk about that really quickly now. As you can see, the iPad is doing something that the computer doesn't, and it makes you wait while it's importing the images. On the computer, you can start doing other things like editing other images or do whatever you want to do in Lightroom, which you cannot do here. You have to wait for the importing to finish. And we are going to see that that is a trend that expands to other things, other time-consuming tasks that you do in Lightroom. So this should be very familiar to those of you who use a Lightroom CC on the desktop. It's the same experience, the same app. It has pretty much all the features. I'm going to mention a few ones that it's lacking here on its mobile version. But yeah, we can do pretty much anything that we can do on the desktop. As you saw, I applied my preset to this photo right here. What I'm going to do now is to select it. I can do it with a shortcut, but I'm going to do it here so you can see what I'm doing. I click on copy settings. I copy all of them. Now go back to the grid, and then here I can select all the images. I can do it with the trackpad, with my finger, with the pencil. That's the cool thing about the iPad, that I can use anything I want. I think that's all of them, that one too. And now I can paste those settings. And once again, as you can see, it's showing this dialog while it's pasting the settings on these 45 photos. So I have to wait. I can't do anything. If I leave the app, I can leave the app and do something else here. But if I come back, it's still what it was before. It's not working in the background. So there is no way around this. One thing we can do if we want to work on something else while we wait for this is to open an app on the side here to work on something else while we wait for that app. It's not ideal, it's not optimal, but it is what it is. When it comes to the editing experience in Lightroom, it's pretty similar to the one that you can experience on the computer. As I said, you have the same controls. You can use the pencil. That's one thing that I like, to use the brush, the healing to remove spots and stuff like that. You can just use the pencil. That is pretty great, much better than using the trackpad or a mouse. It's nothing groundbreaking. You can do all of this on the computer, just a little bit more, I know, enjoyable to do this on an iPad with the pencil. It kind of feels like a little bit more manual and crafty, even though it's still digital. Performance-wise, Lightroom is just okay. It's not any faster or any slower than my in theory, much more powerful MacBook. This is a file, for example, taken with my A7Rii. It's a 42 megapixel file. I handled it just totally fine. I've had no problems whatsoever with this. It struggles a little bit when you are doing the brush to remove spots, the healing brush. If you do a lot of complicated shapes, I guess, it takes a little while to process, but it does the same on the computer, so I don't blame the iPad for that. Otherwise, it's just great. I want to mention a few limitations that do exist when using Lightroom CC mobile compared to the desktop version as of right now. One of them is that you can't merge images to create an HDR merge or a panorama merge. Another one is stacks. You can't stack photos on Lightroom, and this is just an organizational tool. So you could stack, like, for example, if you have one composition and you took several shots of that one composition, just slightly different, you could stack them all so they don't take 20 different slots in your catalog, you have just one. Those are the two major ones that I can think of right now. There are a few minor ones, like the filtering options are not as powerful here. You can't filter by lens or stuff like that. And navigation is not as powerful either. On the desktop, you can navigate by date. You can't do that here, but that's about it. Let's talk about video editing. This was one of my main concerns when switching to the iPad. I use LumaFusion. It's the only choice really out there for the iPad. It was my main concern because I thought that it could be either not as powerful or a much slower process. But LumaFusion has grown a lot in the last few months, and it's added a few features that it was lacking, and now it's a very powerful, surprisingly powerful video editing app. Every video that you've watched in this channel for the last 6-7 months was made on the iPad using LumaFusion. So I'm really not going to show you my workflow when it comes to video because it would make this one super long. I can make a different one if you guys want to, but it's very simple. It's very similar to what I used to do on the computer using Final Cut Pro. That's what I was using before switching to the iPad. My editing is very simple, so I don't really need a lot of advanced features, so that's probably why it works for me. It probably won't work for a lot of people who do other kind of video work. That being said, there are two limitations when using LumaFusion for me coming from Final Cut Pro. The first one is that it doesn't do video stabilization. In Final Cut Pro and Adobe Premiere, you can stabilize your footage a little bit to make it look a little bit more stable. This is something that you cannot do here. Not a huge deal, but you should be aware of it. And the second one is that it doesn't support plugins, third-party plugins. So you are stuck with whatever features it has right off the box. Maybe in the future, but I really doubt it. Other than that, the app is excellent, it's great, and it's probably the best $30 I've ever spent. And that's for editing software. But of course, I use more apps for my photography and video work. The one that I use the most, besides Lightroom and LumaFusion, is Safari, the browser. And the mobile version for the iPad is pretty great. It's very close to the desktop version. But as a former developer myself, I know that a lot of developers out there use Chrome to test their sites because it's the most used browser. So you're gonna find some websites like the very own YouTube Studio, the one that I use to upload these videos and to, add the description, the hashtags and all the cards and all this stuff. It works mostly fine for most features, but it's kind of glitchy for some of them, like subtitles. It behaves the same way on Safari desktop, so Safari mobile is not to blame here. The problem is that when I was working on the computer, I would just use Chrome for those features that didn't really work on Safari. You can download Chrome on the App Store for the iPad, but this Chrome has nothing to do with the Chrome for the desktop. And that is because, as far as I know, every browser that you're gonna find on the App Store uses the Safari engine, so they are all basically the same browser. They are all Safari. Short the story long, some websites might not work 100% on Safari mobile and you don't really have another choice. I'm gonna mention another few apps that I use on a daily basis. Things for my to-do lists, the Notes app, the default Notes app to just collect everything, my thoughts, my ideas, inspiration. I add photos, websites, links, everything goes into my Notes app. I use Spotify to listen to music while I'm writing or editing photos. I use the Gmail app for the weather, very important. I use Dark Sky and Sun Surveyor. I use Google Maps to do some scouting from home. I use Adobe Spark Post to create the thumbnails for these videos. And that's it. Now let's talk about the missing software, the software that I used to use on the computer, but that is not available on the iPad. The first mention has to go to Adobe Photoshop, because Photoshop on the iPad is a joke as of right now. I didn't use Photoshop as often on the computer anyway, but if you do, the app that is available for the iPad is really far from the Photoshop that you know. There are some other alternatives like Pixelmator or Affinity Photo that might be worth taking a look at. Every once in a while I use an app called Star Stacks to create star trails. That is an app that is available for the Mac, but it's not available for the iPad. Again, not a deal breaker for me because I use that app like maybe once a year. As a note, the star trail that I created back in Arches National Park, I used Rachel's computer to create that image. It's an image that I could still create on the iPad if I really wanted to, using, for example, Affinity Photo. You just have to stack all the images in different layers and average all them out. But that would take much longer than using a dedicated software like that one for the Mac. In any case, it's not something that I do very often, so again, not a deal breaker for me, but it might be for you. I don't think we will ever see scanning software on the iPad to scan film. So if you're a film photographer or you want to shoot film every once in a while, you might want to find a lab to ship your rolls to. That's what I'm planning to do from now on. That way I can also get rid of the scanner and all the equipment that I have to develop film and all the chemicals that are kind of nasty there in the closet. One more thing that I'm gonna need in the future, and I'm not entirely sure how this is going to work on the iPad, is software to make books. I'm working on a new book, but I'm still working on the photo selection phase. I'm gonna start working on the text and the layout of that book pretty soon. There is some software out there like Pages from Apple that might be totally usable. To make my last book, Becoming an American, I use Adobe InDesign, so that is a very specific software to do that, and there is no such thing as far as I know for the iPad, so we will see how that goes. I believe that the future of the iPad is very bright. Apple is fully invested on the system because iOS and the App Store are making them much more money than the Mac, for example, ever did. And while it's true that they just released new computers with their own silicon, I do believe that they are going to keep pushing the iPad and iOS as a system that can be used for professional applications, and they're going to keep trying to reach more and more professionals in the future. But since I mentioned the new MacBooks, if you are in the lookout for a new laptop or a new iPad, well, those might be worth a look. The new chip, the M1, is looking very good, and it's promising battery life on par with the iPad. So if that was one of the reasons why you were considering an iPad, well, maybe you want to reconsider. I had been considering switching to an iPad for years, and actually I tried several times, but it never worked. The hardware was there, but the software was not quite there. But today I can say that Lightroom and LumaFusion are good enough for me, for my use case, along with the new features on the iPad like file management and multitasking. Not only I'm able to work from an iPad, but I love it. Some things are really more enjoyable than on the computer. It is true that some others got more complicated, or I have to do some workarounds to make them work. But in the end, the benefits clearly outweigh the cons for me. I try to cover as much ground as possible in this video. If you still have questions about the iPad and about working with photos and video on the iPad, leave a comment down below and I'll try to give you an answer. But my recommendation is, if you already have an iPad around, just try it. Try it for a week, for 2 weeks, forget your computer, work just on that iPad. It might work, who knows? If you don't have an iPad but were considering buying one to complement your computer to bring on road trips, to have a lighter and smaller computer, then if you can afford it, I would say that it would be a great idea and a great addition to your setup. If you don't have an iPad and you are considering getting one to be your only computer, your only device, then I would tell you, please make sure that it does everything that you need it to do. There are some serious limitations to the iPad as of right now. That might change in the future, but yeah, please make sure that you have all the software that you will need. This is all I had to say about the iPad. It's been a long video. I've been talking for a while. It's gonna take me forever to work on the subtitles for this video. But yeah, if you have any questions, as I said, please leave them in the comments down below. For now, thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one.